Hello, I want to talk about how colonialism shaped the criminal justice system and continues to affect indigenous peoples in Canada. This is about source 2. Colonialism refers to European expansion which began in the 15th century. European explorers believed they had the right to claim new lands, take resources, and impose their culture on indigenous peoples. This was justified by the doctrine of discovery, a legal idea that claimed new lands belonged to no one, allowing European nations to take control. However, this ignored the fact that indigenous people had lived on these lands for thousands of years. In Canada, colonization happened through treaties and agreements between indigenous nations and European settlers. However, many of these treaties were broken or ignored when they no longer served colonial interests. When Canada became a country in 1867, indigenous people lost more control over their lands and lives. Along with colonial expansion came the idea of nationhood, which divided people into groups based on ethnicity and race. European colonizers used race as a tool to justify their control over indigenous people. Scientific racism, a now discredited idea, was used to claim that Europeans were superior to other races, making colonialism seem acceptable. Du Bois described this as a color line, a global system where lighter skinned people dominated darker skinned people. Colonialism was not just about taking land, it was about controlling people through legal and political systems. Under the British Empire, all colonies followed British laws and were ruled from the motherland. The British believed they had a duty to civilize indigenous people. One major tool of control was the criminal justice system. English criminal law was applied in early colonies and became the foundation of Canada's legal system. After Canada's Confederation in 1867, the first Canadian Criminal Code was based on British law in 1873. Canada created the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, also known as RCMP, modeled after British police forces. However, unlike indigenous justice systems which focused on restoring balance, the European legal system emphasized punishment and property rights, often working against indigenous interests. Canada's economy depended on resource extraction and trade, particularly the fur trade. Treaties initially limited how much land settlers could take, but over time, indigenous peoples were stripped of their land and rights. The RCMP played a major role in enforcing these policies. One of the most harmful laws was the Indian Act, which controlled almost every aspect of indigenous life. The RCMP enforced this law by restricting indigenous people movement through the pass system, which required indigenous individuals to get permission before leaving their reserves. This system acted as a form of border control and criminalized indigenous life. The RCMP was central to expanding settler control. For example, in 1870, the RCMP helped remove the legitimate government in Manitoba to make way for settlers. They also fought indigenous peoples to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, which expanded colonial settlement on unceded indigenous lands. The RCMP helped relocate indigenous people, often by force, and distributed lands to settlers in violation of treaties. They also suppressed indigenous cultural practices like the sun dance and potlatch, which were crucial to indigenous identity. One of the most devastating roles of the RCMP was enforcing the residential school system. Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and placed in government and church-run schools where they were faced abuse, malnutrition, and cultural erasure. The RCMP acted as strong officers, returning children who tried to escape these schools. Thousands of indigenous children died in these situations, and the harm caused by this system still affects indigenous communities today. Understanding this history is crucial because colonialism is not just something of the past. The criminal justice system continues to disproportionately target indigenous peoples in Canada. Indigenous individuals are overrepresented in Canadian prisons, and systemic racism still exists in policing and legal institutions. Recognizing how colonial laws were designed to control and suppress indigenous peoples helps us understand why these inequalities persist today. So, what can we do? First, we must acknowledge the harm colonialism has caused and support indigenous sovereignty. This includes respecting treaty rights, addressing systemic racism in the justice system, and pushing for reforms that prioritize indigenous voices. Second, we need to educate ourselves and others about the realities of colonialism and its ongoing effects. The more we understand, the better we can work toward justice and reconciliation. Colonialism was not just an unfortunate event in history, it was a crime that shaped the legal and political systems we live under today. By recognizing this, we can take steps towards meaningful change. Thank you.